Hi, everyone. I'm Jay Wang, Director of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. I'm very pleased to welcome you to CPD Conversations. A couple of announcements before we begin today's program. This Thursday, we will be hosting a discussion titled Building Omnichannel Media Strategies for Public Diplomacy, which will help us better understand a new ecosystem in order to pursue data-driven strategies for public diplomacy. On Tuesday, the 8th, next Tuesday, November the 8th, we will announce the 2022 recipient of the Emery Prize for Innovation in Public Diplomacy at a special award event at USC. This annual prize was established by CPD in collaboration with the US Department of State to recognize foreign and civil service officers for creative and scalable initiatives that advance global public diplomacy. The award program will also feature a discussion on the next generation of interactivity and storytelling and on what lies ahead in the metaverse for creating new opportunities for public diplomacy. So join us in person or online by registering for these events at our website. Today's program focuses on global mega events from World Expo Dubai to World Cup Qatar. These days, only a few mass events are able to grab worldwide attention. One may count the Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, and the World Expo. They are dramatic, massive spectacles that exemplify both global and national consciousness. They may be used by host and participating countries as part of their nation branding efforts, as moments of national celebration, and as part of their long-term planning and development. As a ritual for countries to attain international visibility, they certainly constitute a unique global communal moment with transformative potential, which are made ever more poignant in these times of growing international division and tension. These events have always reflected the underlying landscape of international relations and the shifting global political economy. They are making debut in the Middle East. The World Cup, which begins on November the 21st, is Qatar's first global mega event and follows the UAE's hosting of Expo 2020 Dubai, the first world's affair in the Middle East. To help us unpack the social significance of global mega events in the region and beyond, we are joined by Kevin Baxter, staff writer at the Los Angeles Times, and Matthew Asada, currently US public diplomat in residence at CPD. Kevin has covered 6 World Cups, 4 Olympic Games, 6 World Series, and 1 Super Bowl, and has contributed to 3 Pulitzer Prize winning series at the Los Angeles Times and Miami Herald. Matthew Asada has spent 2 decades with the U.S. Foreign Service. He has served abroad in Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates, where he was most recently the Deputy Commissioner General of the USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai. So welcome, both of you, and I'll turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Jay. And thank you for all of those that are joining us here in person at University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism, as well as to our online audience. We want to extend a special welcome to our representatives from the Department of State, from the Qatari Consulate General here in Los Angeles, as well as the United Arab Emirates Consulate in LA as well. We thought it would be fitting to host this event together, Kevin and I, to talk about these global mega events and what they have done for the region and what they mean for the world. And what we're going to do in the next hour or so of conversation amongst each other, with you and our online audience, is to talk a little bit about the events, what they mean for the host country, what it means for United States participation in these events. We're excited that the United States qualified and is part of the World Cup here in Doha in a little bit. Kevin will give you a little bit of a preview of what to expect beyond the men's team, just as far as soccer is concerned. And then for those that are interested in visiting Doha or tuning in online, we'll tell you a little bit about how we can do that. I think it's fitting that we're here at the Annenberg School, which recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. Last year and this year as well, the UAE celebrated its Golden Jubilee, 50 years as an independent country. The United States and Qatar are celebrating 50 years of bilateral relations. So it's amazing to think what can be created in such a short span. And I think here at the University of Southern California, in addition to all of our faculty at the Annenberg School that are focused on some of these global mega events or sports journalism, we're very excited because obviously Los Angeles will be hosting the Men's World Cup along with the United States, 10 other cities, and Canada and Mexico, and the Olympics in 2028. So these global mega events really have a home here in Los Angeles, and many people have contributed to them over the years. So to get us started, again, we'll try to baseline for everyone's understanding. Maybe, Kevin, you can talk a little bit about what is FIFA 2022 World Cup in Doha.
Well, the World Cup probably doesn't need much introduction. It's the biggest sporting event in the world. There'll be 32 teams going to Qatar. This will be the last tournament with 32 teams. When it comes to LA, Mexico, Canada in 2026, there'll be 48 teams. So this will be the final 32 team tournament. It's 28 days. A lot of firsts with this World Cup, though. In addition to this is the 21st World Cup ever held, and again, it's the longest and biggest sporting event in the world. Well over 1 billion TV viewers will tune in over the length of the tournament. What's really interesting about this one, though, it's set it apart from all the others, is it's the first World Cup that'll be held entirely in one city. It'll all be in Doha. No two stadiums are further than 35 kilometers apart. When we were at the World Cup in 2014 in Brazil, the U.S. had a 4.5-hour flight to one game, so a 9-hour round trip. Everything will be within 35 kilometers of one another. It's also the first World Cup in the Middle East, the first World Cup in a majority Muslim country. And Qatar, with about 2.9 million residents, is the smallest country ever to host a World Cup or an Olympics. So there's a lot of history that's going to be made in this World Cup. It also ends, the last game is going to be played on December 18th, which is Qatari's National Day, which is a big celebration. So that's kind of a cool thing. By the way, when we have the World Cup here, we don't know when it's going to open and we don't know when it's going to end, but July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. My guess is the U.S. will play a game on that day somewhere, probably in Philadelphia.
Well, I think that you mentioned, again, the first time in the Middle East for the World Cup, for the Expo as well, first time being hosted in a Muslim country. And we'll get into maybe some of the cultural considerations for visitors a little bit later here. But the biggest event, again, to watch for spectators, the World Cup. And that compares with, the World's Fair. Again, it's the largest event of its type, 6 months long. And it was the first time that any country actually in the Middle East, North Africa, or South Asia had hosted this. Expo 2020, Dubai, it was scheduled to take place in 2020, 2021, had to be delayed 1 year because of COVID. The international community came together. And it really was amazing to see the UAE deliver this in the middle of a global pandemic. That's fortunately one thing that maybe Qatar will not have to deal with, this time around. But I think it's just really impressive to see these two global mega events taking place here in the Middle East for the first time. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is just the launch phase for these projects. I mean, the Doha was awarded the World Cup in December of 2010. Dubai was awarded it in November of 2013. So it's more than a decade really in planning for some of these for these events, and the infrastructure that was created kind of by the host country is quite impressive. For the UAE, they built about $10 billion worth, invested in a whole new city district with a new metro line, with a convention center. And October 1st, just this year, 1 year later, they inaugurated Expo City as a living legacy for the emirate, for the country. I understand that Doha has also invested quite a bit in the infrastructure to host these games that are coming up.
Yeah, they spent about about $20 billion. But it's part of a larger project, the 2030 project, which actually began before they awarded the World Cup. This was announced around 2008, and it was a long-term project. They built a metro line, a lot of highways, a lot of buildings, apartments, hotels. And then they added the stadiums. 8 stadiums were added onto that. The foresight that went into this is really amazing. All of these stadiums, I think 7 of them will be about 40,000 seats. That's way too big for a city or a country of 2.9 million people. So a lot of these stadiums are multi-use stadiums. The top deck will be taken off, actually be removed from the stadium. It'll be sent to a third world country through FIFA, a country that needs stadium infrastructure. Each stadium has a sort of theme to it. There's one that looks like a boat. There's one that is actually the largest tent in the world. It's made to look like a Bedouin tent. The Qatari culture is really a big part of this, of what they're doing. So there will be a legacy that goes beyond this. And when you look at the construction and what they're going to leave behind, it's not quite like an Olympics where you leave an Olympic village behind and a lot of other things. This is stuff that the Qataris will be able to use on a daily basis once this tournament is over. So, again, the foresight that went into this, they did have when they got the World Cup in 2010, they did have the longest run up in history, 12 years to prepare for this. And so far it seems like everything's going well.
Well, you mentioned kind of the architecture and the legacy, and for the UAE as well, they built this entire new district with some star architects. Calatrava designed the UAE pavilion, which we'll see a little bit later here. American architect Gordon Gill was involved with the Al Wasl Dome, which is the largest projectable 360 dome in the world. And they're going to have second lives, all of these places that are being built, whether it's for Doha or Dubai. One of the things that I think I was struck by in the UAE for Expo 2020 was just the cultural program. I mean, yes, the World's Fair, for those of you that are less familiar with it, it's about presenting your country. They have national pavilions. There's a theme. This one was Connecting Minds, Creating the Future overall. It's not a trade fair, but really it is an opportunity to promote the country, to promote its culture, and to promote business. And the cultural program was very strong in Expo 2020 Dubai in the UAE. The Emiratis brought in some amazing world-class talent. And again, American, South Asian, African, to correspond to the demographics of the region, being, I think it's 2/3 of the world's population within like a 6-hour flight of Dubai. And I understand that in Qatar for Doha, there's also going to be an amazing cultural program that might happen alongside the World Cup in FIFA 2022. Was there anything you want to comment on some of the cultural attractions there in the country?
I wanted to add one thing about the stadiums. One of the cool things about the stadiums is when they built these stadium projects, as they went to the local communities, and again, it's a pretty compressed area, but there are local neighborhoods as there might be here in Los Angeles. When they went to the local communities and said, we're going to build a stadium here, what do you need in this community? One community said, we'd really like to have a park. So a park became part of the stadium complex. It's on the grounds of the stadium. Another community said, you know what, we have to go all the way into downtown for weddings. We don't have a wedding chapel here. One stadium now are going to have a wedding chapel in it. Another stadium is going to have a medical clinic. So they actually went to the community and said, what can we do to make this better for you? We're going to spend billions on these stadiums. Let's throw in a couple of bells and whistles that are going to help you. And so that was really cool. The cultural thing is, so much of these mega events, Olympics, World Cups, World Expos, are really focused on the West. I remember going to the World Cup in South Africa in 2010, and the main artist was Shakira, the Colombian singer who lives in Spain, and we're in Africa. And I just thought that was so strange. In Qatar, there will be a lot of regional artists that will perform there. There will be music festivals. There will be art festivals. There's going to be fan fest everywhere. But the Qataris, I think to their credit, are trying to push the local culture. And one of the things that the people in the Supreme Committee for Legacy of the World Cup told me is that they believe that by opening the world up to Qatar, that they can show and showcase their culture and their people. They believe that people in the West, especially, but all over the world, probably have misconceptions about what the Middle East is about and what their culture is about. And so their message is come in here, try this, look around, see for yourself, and then go back with your own opinions. Don't come in with don't go back with the misconceptions you came in with. Come in, take a look around. Maybe you won't like it. Maybe you won't. Maybe it's just not your cup of tea. Maybe you will like it, but whatever your opinion is, it'll be your opinion and not what someone else has told you. So that I think is a strength of this World Cup in that it is going to be about Qatar. It's not going to be about the West coming to South Africa or Brazil. It's going to be about the Qatari people and the Qatari culture. It's one of the youngest countries in the world. That's another thing that it has with the World Cup. It only declared its independence 51 years ago. So it's also the youngest country ever host a World Cup.
So some of these, again, amazing world-class cultural attractions in the UAE, obviously we have the Abu Dhabi, the Louvre, they have the Guggenheim that's coming up. We had the Museum of the Future that was inaugurated and opened during Expo 2020. And I know that there's some just real amazing architecture and museums that Qatar also has by some great architects. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about that.
Yeah, they have a national museum, which is amazing. It's huge. The architecture, it's interesting because you go to the museum to see the exhibitions inside, and really the architecture outside is what really stops your heart. The National Museum is beautiful. It just opened. There was an Islamic art museum, which is actually in the bay. It extends into the bay. You have to walk across a bridge to get there. It also is beautiful. It just reopened. It has some priceless Islamic art going back 8 or 9 centuries. Also, the National Library is, you think, why would I go to a World Cup and go to a library? The National Library, which is attached to the Education City complex, where there are international universities, or I think there's 8 from the United States that are represented there. The National Library is amazing. Not only does it have books, which you expect from a library, has a great cafeteria, but on the second floor, there's a room where you can go and record a record album. There's a room where you can go use the internet. There's a room where you can go, there's a 3D printer where you can go make things with a 3D printer. Anyone can walk off the street and use these things. There's also a sports museum, which is amazing. Again, Qatar, not an athletic powerhouse, but so a lot of this stuff is sports things collected from around the world. Muhammad Ali has boxing gloves in there. There's a Babe Ruth bat. It's just a celebration of sports, and it's actually attached to one of the stadiums. One last museum they have an International Museum of Slavery, which there's been a lot of emphasis on the workers' rights in Qatar. It's pretty bold for the Qataris to go ahead and have a museum of slavery, sort of to address that issue head on.
I think that we're still going to learn more in the coming days about, all the activities that are in store for visitors to the World Cup. The Sheikha Mayasa, the chairperson for Qatari Museums, has created this thing called Qatar Creates. And I believe there are going to be several American artists that will be traveling to Doha and performing at some of these, in front of some of this iconic architecture. So stay tuned to hear more about that. Let's talk a little bit about actually the United States and U.S. participation in these global mega events. So we're fortunate, as I said, that the United States qualified here for the World Cup. Can you talk about what we can expect for the U.S. men's team?
Yeah, we're really lucky they did qualify because they didn't go to the last World Cup in Russia. They did qualify this time. They will have the team has not been announced yet. The roster has not been announced. It will be announced next Wednesday. But just based on the player pool, there are a number of injuries, so we'll see how that works out. But just based on the player pool, the U.S. team is expected to be the youngest of the 32 teams in Qatar. The interesting thing about this team is the core of the team, guys like Christian Pulisic, Weston McKennie, Tyler Adams, names you may have heard. These Gio Reyna, these are guys who are very young, not in their prime yet. And the thinking seems to be that this team, this is sort of a dress rehearsal for 2026. That's the World Cup where the U.S. wants to be competitive, where they want to go deep in the tournament. So this team is sort of the 2026 team, if you will. Still, the U.S. will open the tournament. The tournament begins on November 20th. Qatar was going to open the tournament as one of a number of games. Now they've decided to move Qatar back one day. They will have the spotlight on themselves, on their national team when they open against Ecuador. They'll have the first game. The U.S. will open on the second day, November 21st. They will play Wales in their first game. They also play England in group play, and then the final game will be against Iran. And 4 teams in each group. The top 2 advance to the round of 16. Not advancing to the round of 16 would be, even with this young team, would be a failure for the U.S. So they need to get at least out of group play, move into the knockout rounds. And then soccer is a very low scoring game. Anything can happen, a fluky goal, a bad call by a referee. Once you get to that round of 16, it's single elimination. So anything can happen at that point.
So I think you said that there are 32 teams this time around. Is that right? So the United States was one of 32 participating in the upcoming World Cup. One contrast with the World's Fair, with the Expo, is that there was universal participation. You don't have to qualify for it. But we're really, the UAE prided itself on having a World's Fair that was open to the world, where each country would have its own pavilion. That was the first time in World's Fair history that that had been the case. So there were 192 countries. And the United States was fortunate to be part of that. We started a little bit later than other countries. We were not the last to sign our participation contract, but it was great to see everyone there, including Qatar, there at the World's Fair as well. And I think that since this event, did take place in the past, we wanted to share with you a couple of pictures and photos from that journey to give people a little bit of a sense of what the World's Fair is, because I think seeing really is believing. And we're fortunate to have some imagery that we can share kind of from that event. So we can give us 1 second here. We'll transition over to a slideshow to share some photos with the audience here in person as well as online. And I would encourage those that are tuning in online that if you'd like to ask any questions, please do direct them to our hosts there. We're collecting questions and then we will use them as part of the Q&A. So I want to take you on a journey of the USA Pavilion and the people that helped to bring it to life along its 5-year journey. Next slide. It's a tribute to the more than 300 full-time staff from more than 40 countries that worked at the USA Pavilion, and our Expo units in Washington, D.C. and the Consulate General Dubai, the pavilion's operation team that you see behind me, and next slide, the 72 youth ambassadors that joined us from across the United States. This was really important to us to have, again, young Americans that were fluent in multiple languages from every state across the country representing us and greeting visitors, the 1.5 million people that experienced the USA Pavilion at Expo 2020 Dubai. This was a 5-year journey. Many were involved, including LA-based actors or California-based actors, shall I say. Next slide. We have our architects, Woods Baggett. There in the middle is Pat Daly, who used to be in the San Francisco office. We had LA-based Thinkwell Group and Electra Exhibitions based in Dubai that helped to build our pavilion in Dubai. Next slide. And a special thanks goes to Expo 2020 and the United Arab Emirates, without whom we would not have been able to participate in the spectacular World's Fair. Next slide. 50 years ago, as the USA Pavilion reminded us, this was all just a dream. Next slide. As was our dream of a man on that moon. But that dream and the vision of our founding fathers became real for the UAE. Next slide. This is the Calatrava Design Pavilion. Next slide. In the more than 192 countries around the world. The United States story began with our intention to participate in 2017 and continued with the signing of our participation contract in January of 2020. Next slide. We broke ground for the pavilion in January 2020. Next slide. Poured the first concrete in March of 2020. Next slide. You can see the building going up behind us. It was a prefabricated construction, which helped us get it done in the short period of time that we had. Next slide. Seeing the stars. At the same time that we were building the building, we were designing the stars, which were an integral element for the USA Pavilion, drawing on our heritage. Next slide. And of course, here it is our then ambassador, John Ricolta Jr., along with our Consul General, Phil Frayne. Next slide. One of the key landmarks for the U.S. Pavilion was the SpaceX rocket. And this was something that we actually created in partnership with SpaceX. If you flew in here to LAX, you can see their rocket coming out of the airport. But we actually worked with companies within the UAE to put this together. Next slide. All of this we worked on, and I just want to pause here because it came up a little bit earlier, Kevin, worker welfare. This was really important, safety on the construction sites. And I think this is one of the things that was interesting, that with the international community coming out to Dubai with the focus of the world's attention, worker welfare became very important. And we were fortunate, our ambassador, John Ricolta, came from the construction industry, as did our Commissioner General Bob Clark. And so they were really focused on ensuring that at the USA Pavilion that we had an accident-free site. But that went for the entire Expo 2020. And yes, unfortunately, there were some people that lost their lives in construction and accidents, but they created a very nice memorial to those workers at the Expo site, which will be, again, part of their memorial to what they were able to create. Next slide. So as we were getting ready for the buildings construction, which completed in November of 2020, next slide, we turned our attention to the inside. Next slide. And this was the exhibition itself. So the theme of the USA Pavilion was life, liberty, and creating the future. Again, we worked with brilliant experience designers, Thinkwell Group based here in LA. They do a lot of work with museums, with entertainment, with theme park. And our exhibit 4, the big show, really was quite spectacular. Next slide. You can see, again, we talked about the future of innovation and how we're bringing American technology to the heavens. Next slide. Quite an attraction for everyone that came. We also wanted to tell the story of American liberty, freedom, and independence. Again, the Statue of Liberty, the torch, which was actually displayed at the 1876 World's Fair, the first one that took place in America in Philadelphia. Next slide. Modeled obviously after the original there on Ellis Island. This is Dr. Stephen Briganti. And what's great, I just want to highlight him. He was one of more than 50 speakers that came to the USA Pavilion during the 6 months to share a little bit about American culture. And we talked in a discussion about, the value of immigration to our country. Next slide. We also did outreach across the country as well. So this was in New York City, talking about their legacy of World's Fair's participation. We did this with Dubai Tourism. And I know that, again, Qatar Tourism is doing something similar in advance of their event. Next slide. Next slide. All of this was so that we could have our Commissioner General, Bob Clark, and his lovely wife, Jane, ready on September 25th to start receiving some of the first visitors coming through as some of the tests are tested out. And next slide. When Expo actually opened on October 1st of 2021, again, delayed a year due to COVID, we were so proud to welcome the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, as the first visitor to the USA Pavilion on opening day. Next slide. During that 6 months, we would then receive about 1.5 million visitors who would come and touch the moon and think about the possibilities of space exploration. The idea of having something tactile that you could really, again, not just see the moon, but again, touch the moon was quite a big hit. Next slide. More than 5,000 protocol visitors from 109 countries, including heads of state and government. Next slide. Ministers. Next slide. UN officials. Next slide. Came to the pavilion, including next slide, about 50 US government delegations. Next slide. Including a presidential delegation, members of Congress. Next slide. The Librarian of Congress, and senior department officials. Next slide. We had CEOs of American companies stopping by to learn more about how the pavilion was promoting tourism and facilitating travel. Here's the CEO of a large American hotel firm that came to speak with a consular officer that had a stand there at the pavilion about how you could safely travel overseas and what the Department of State was doing to facilitate that. Next slide. We had delegations from more than half a dozen U.S. states and cities. Here, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, where I went to high school. Next slide. Pavilion and its partners hosted about 175 events with almost 9,000 attendees. The commercial program that went alongside our cultural program was quite strong here during Expo 2020. Next slide, including several programs with the US-UAE Business Council. 40 cultural acts, 53 speakers, 6 American chefs from all 50 states would share American culture. Next slide, including 2 astronauts. Next slide. From outer space. Next slide. Next slide. From the International Space Station, sending us a greeting. Next slide, and others who visit us back here on Earth. Next slide, manifesting the cooperation between the United States and our international partners. Next slide. We partnered with other pavilions. Next slide. Such as Ireland, Riverdance Troupe, and next slide, Canada, on cultural collaborations. Next slide, and companies on iconic programming with Mickey and Minnie. Next slide, and National Geographic from above. Next slide. As part of the United States contributions to this cultural program that I mentioned before, Expo 2020 brought together itself artists such as Alicia Keys and Christina Aguilera. One of the interesting things is that being the first time this happening in the Middle East was we tried to bring the region together. Next slide. We had 38 Expo 2020 fellows from 19 countries, Morocco to Bangladesh, that would convene for the department's first exchange program in the region and first exchange to be hosted at a USA pavilion at a World's Fair. Next slide. This was sponsored by PepsiCo Foundation, and we're really excited to see that the connections that came from these fellows, the new business opportunities, are really helping to promote the economic activity in that region. And we're excited to see what they still have in store. Next slide. We celebrate the UAE's National Day on December 2nd and Golden Jubilee with a giant flag. Next slide, and commemorative stamp. And all of this, next slide, culminated in our celebrations of National Day on March 6th. Next slide. 2022. Next slide. When we open the sustainability gate. Next slide. We had our official ceremony in Al Wasl. Next slide. We paraded through the Expo grounds. Next slide. We celebrated with a gala dinner, including with an LA-based chef, Exhibit 4. Next slide. And we lit up Al Wasl in the sky with our American story. Next slide. So today, next slide. Next slide. After the billboards come down on Sheikh Zayed Road, next slide, and there are no more Expo 2020 visitors at the Dubai, Sharjah, and Abu Dhabi airports, next slide, we'll think about the physical legacy of Expo City, which is reopened last month. Next slide. And all of the friends we made along the way. So that's just a little bit of a overview of the U.S. participation at Expo 2020 Dubai, snapshot of one of 192 countries of what the UAE and Dubai made possible. What I want to turn to maybe now, if we can, Kevin, is just talk a little bit more about what we are expecting to see. What might be different, this World Cup versus World Cups in the past?
Well, one thing is going to be the crowding and the clash of cultures. Qatar, the entire country of Qatar is about the size of Connecticut. Population is slightly larger than Chicago. And there's going to be 1.2 million World Cup visitors coming in a 28-day period. This is into Doha. This is a city with about 30,000 hotel rooms. So you can imagine the crush already. Airlines in 7 neighboring countries are offering daily shuttles so people can come in and come out. As you mentioned, COVID, the Qatari government today has said you no longer need COVID tests to get into the country starting November 1st. So that's not an issue for World Cup visitors. But crowding will be. The Qataris have already told some residents that if you live near a stadium, you're going to need a special permit to get in and out of your house. They're asking people not to use their private cars on game days because some of the areas around stadiums, again, very compact, right? There's going to be 4 games a day. Some of that area is going to be very crowded. So we're expecting that, especially during the group stage, to be a little bit crowded. But I think the class of cultures is, and I use that not in a derogatory way, because the Western culture, the people from Western cultures coming in will be seen, many of them will be seen in Islamic country for the first time. And there are some things that are different. And this has caused some concern among people. The first of all is, yes, it is true. In Qatari law, homosexuality is banned. People are not jailed for that on a regular basis. But one of the things that I asked is, I said, so if you're there and you're a male and you have your husband there, or a female and you have your wife there, can you hold hands? Can you do those things? And they said, you know what? It has nothing to do with gay rights or not. That is a public display of affection, which in our culture is frowned upon. You don't do that in public. So it has nothing to do with whether you're with a man or a woman. It has to do with, we just don't have public displays of affection there. That's something that there will be a class of culture over that. I think the big issue, though, the one everyone's talking about, is the alcohol. It's a Muslim country. Alcohol is not banned, but it's very hard to get. You can get it at certain restaurants, hotels, some bars. In the stadium, in the bowl, as you're watching the game, you will not be able to drink alcoholic beverages. There will be fan fests at every stadium. There'll be a huge fan fest that'll run about 19, 20 hours a day just outside Doha, where alcohol will be available. So you will be able to get beer in Qatar. Here's my fear, though. Anyone who's gone to an international soccer event, whether it's a Champions League or European Championships or World Cup, beer is ever present. It's everywhere. And so I think people leaving the stadiums, they will go to the fan fest, they'll have a couple of beers. And then my fear is, public drunkenness, by the way, is another thing that is frowned upon in Islamic culture. So as they leave this fan fest, after having a couple of beers, I can imagine a couple of guys talking to each other and say, you know what, let's go back to our apartment and have a nightcap. Oh, wait, we can't do that. We can't buy beer in the store. We don't have beer in our refrigerator. So they'll stay and have a few more. And I just think the idea of people not wanting to leave that fan fest, not wanting to go home where there's no alcohol in their apartments or hotels, that to me is the fear, that people will have that one too many for the road. And I think that's one problem. I think a lot of the other things about the cultural differences, I think all those things will work themselves out. But that's the one fear that I have.
Well, I think this is a good time to make a plug for the U.S. Embassy in Doha. They actually have a great page that's been set up for visitors to the World Cup. And like anyone traveling overseas, we encourage you to check out travel.state.gov to find out information about traveling to a certain country. They have a special World Cup page there as well. But what I was really taken by was a video that Embassy Doha had done. It's about 7 minutes, and it's for first-time visitors to Qatar. So what to expect, some of those cultural conventions, questions about alcohol, questions about homosexuality. I think it's really helpful what the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Doha has done to put together this video, and I encourage folks to check it out. You mentioned alcohol, and at the Expo 2020 Dubai, there was alcohol that was sold here, albeit in, at different pavilions or at different restaurants. And I think there was some concern maybe that things might get a little unruly or out of hand, but it was amazing to see the international visitors, the respect for the local culture, the Emirati visitors, the families that were going, and just taking advantage of the family entertainment. And there were not as many, obviously, incidents as one might have expected or feared. Now, I understand that the Expo visitor is a little bit different than the soccer fan. But hopefully, I think with the Fan Fest and other things that they've put in place, and just this pre-education that's being done for visitors to the Gulf, hopefully maybe some of those issues may be avoided. If we're not fortunate like yourself to be able to go out to travel to Doha and Qatar and see the event in person, along with the million others that are going, where can we watch the World Cup here in the United States?
Well, all the World Cup games will be on Fox in English and Telemundo in Spanish. Every game will be covered live. I wanted to add the thing about when you talk about the cultural thing. If you're going to get on a plane and fly 16 and a half hours to Qatar, which is what a nonstop flight takes, you really don't want to land in a place that looks just like your neighborhood, if you know what I mean. You're going there to see the World Cup, sure, but you're also going there to experience a different culture. And when I went there, my visit there, I appreciated the fact that I was in a different place. And it is a different culture. It's a different religion. It's a different style of life, different weather, everything, different food. There's a lot of things that you will be comfortable with if you visit there. There are a lot of things that you will not be comfortable with, but that's sort of part of the growth. That's why we go to these countries. As some of the Qataris explained it to me, it's if you come to someone's house and they say, you know, would you please take your shoes off and leave them at the door before you come to my house? That's a fairly common request. You wouldn't say no. You wouldn't just storm into someone's house and with muddy shoes and track all over their carpet. The Qataris are just making some basic request based on their culture, that Westerners observe. And again, that's why we're going to these countries. I do have to add, one thing I know a lot of people are going to wonder about the worker abuse there. There was a system that's very popular throughout the Middle East, used in a lot of countries, the kafala system, where workers are brought in. It's in some ways not a system all that different from indentured servitude, where the people are they come in at the permission of the workers, of their companies, excuse me, and in Qatar, about 2.5 million or 2.5 million or so of the residents of the country are foreign workers or foreigners. The number of citizens is very low. There has been some criticism about that. And some of the worker abuse is supposedly still going on. We saw Reuters report last week that foreign workers were being evicted from their apartments to make room for World Cup visitors. So there are still some of those issues, but even that you can sort of look at. The Qataris recognize that. I talked to one woman who was a government official, and she said most of the young people in the country never have like the kafala system. They wanted to get rid of it, and the World Cup has become a way to do that. The kafala system now is not the law of the land anymore. That's not to say workers across the board got pay raises. That's not to say that everything is great for the workers, but the Qataris say, look, we're 50 years old. It took the U.S. how many centuries to get rid of slavery in the United States? Give us some time. We're trying to address this issue. And again, the young people are looking at the World Cup as a way to not only bring the West in, but to bring in some Western values, not to change the culture, but to bring in some Western values. And I think foreign workers may be one group of people that will see some of the benefits of that.
Great. And I want to remind those that are tuning in online, please, if you have any questions, do submit them online so that we can bring them into the conversation. About 15 minutes left here, and I'm going to open up to Q&A in a couple of minutes. But again, I think we'll come back to maybe this question because there was one on kafala and the migrant workers and just overall what this means, for Qatar and for the country. But let's just take a moment maybe to reflect on kind of what's next, here for the region. You had obviously Dubai's successful hosting of Expo 2020. They've opened up Expo City this year, October 1st. And next year in 2023, they're going to be hosting COP28, the Conference on Parties. So they're using it as a venue for these, global gatherings, international conferences. The World Cup in Doha here. And then next year, they're going to be hosting Qatar, the Horticultural Expo, the Grand Flower Show. That's also administered by the Bureau of International Expositions. And we have countries like Saudi Arabia that's bidding to host the 2030 Expo, one of several countries that is competing for that event. The only global mega event that hasn't yet taken place in the region is the Olympics. What do you think about that coming to the region?
Well, it's funny going around Doha. That's one thing I said to some of the government officials that I was with is it looks like you guys are getting ready for the Olympics, just the way the stadiums are set up and the hotels. And they have already bid for the Olympics twice. They did not make the final round. For an Olympic game and a World Cup, there's a bidding process where countries bid and then officials from the FIFA or from the International Olympic Committee look at those bids, and then it goes on to a final round. Qatar never made the final, but they are bidding again for the 2036 Olympics. And a successful World Cup, as we've seen before with other countries. Brazil is an example. The United States is an example. You have a successful World Cup or Olympics, you are then in line to get that next event. So if they can pull this World Cup off, I think that sets them up pretty well. One thing to remember about Qatar, since they started this legacy project in 2008, they've hosted over 600 international sporting events. Not talking about the horticultural events, but sporting events. They've had F1 events, open wheel auto racing. They've had table tennis. They've had equestrian events. They had the World Track and Field Championships. They've had a number of regional soccer events. Nothing like this, though, and this is a good trial run for the Olympics. I mean, think about a country with 2.9 million people bringing in another 1.2 million in a span of 28 days. This is going to really test the infrastructure in Qatar. Frankly, seeing some of the things that have happened lately, some of the test events they've had recently, I'm not sure that they totally are prepared for this. I'm not sure. I think it's nice to look at the numbers on paper, but I think when the people begin arriving, I think there's going to be one of those moments where it's like, oh my God, is this really what we asked for? But they have had these world events before, and the reason they're doing that, as you know, is Qatar wants to expose itself to the world, so to speak, but also it needs to diversify. It's rich in oil and natural gas, but that's not the future of Qatar. It's not the future of the Middle East. Qatar wants to be known as a world center for education. That's why they have Education City and all these international campuses. It wants to be known as a international center for diplomacy. A lot of peace talks, including the U.S. and Afghanistan, the Ukrainians and the Russians, a lot of those have been facilitated by the Qataris. That's one thing that they want to become part of. And then we talked about the museums. They want to see themselves as an international art center, an international center of museums and culture. And that's what they're trying to expose. And so when you go to the World Cup, you really owe it to yourself to go see some of these facilities, because I guarantee you in 5, 10, 15 years, you're going to be reading about them. And if you had the chance to go visit them and didn't, that's going to be a real loss.
So again, I want to remind our audience, please, to submit your questions. We'll also turn here to the room if there's any question here at the Annenberg School. But we did have one that came in, and it was talking about, again, some of the controversies that, you've kind of alluded to. There's the bidding process, the kafala system, the LGBT rights and protections. Supporters of the competition emphasize the significance of having one of the world's largest mega events in the global South, and specifically in the Arab and Muslim world, and use whataboutism to claim that the West has been using sports for imperial and colonial purposes. Do you agree with the classification of this upcoming event as a sports washing initiative to launder the country's image on human rights violations, or do you see it as a legitimate soft power and nation branding attempt that is scrutinized because of Western bias or even Islamophobia? Now, this is nice that I get to ask you this question, the journalist, for your thoughts.
Well, I've heard a lot about the concept of sport washing, and Russia had the Winter Olympics in Sochi, and then they just had the World Cup in 2018. And some of these issues were brought up. Homosexuality is against the law in Russia. We had no problems that I know of. The Russians said that we would recognize international norms, and they did. We'll see what happens with Qatar. As far as the worker thing goes, the Guardian newspaper of England said between 2010 and 2020, over 8,600 foreign workers died working on Olympic projects. That's World Cup projects, excuse me. That is a figure that a lot of international human rights groups have reprinted, reused. There is a problem with the worker system. To the Qataris' credit, they have recognized that, they have spoken about it. That's where maybe sports washing is the wrong term, because the Qataris tell me we would not have even talked about the kafala system if the world was not coming, and if the world had not protested some of our policies. They have said, yeah, we need to work on this. And so they have. I think that during the games, there's too much focus on the world. For the Qataris have told me, look, we would not have invited the world if we didn't want them to see what was in our closets. We've invited them to come in and look around. We're using this as a chance for us to grow. We do have some lines in the sand. There are certain things that our culture will not accept. But they don't want to make this into a gulag at the same token. So I think it's all for the good. The more that the world can come and look at some countries that maybe that aren't, England, the US, China, that are on the world stage, the more that we can come in and sort of look at that, the more they grow and the more we grow. I do think that they have addressed the worker issue. Is it perfect? No. Again, we saw evictions last week with some of the foreign workers. They did all get a minimum wage raise, though, as part of the international scrutiny. The questioner asked something about whether, you look at Western imperialism and Western countries host international sporting events, and people don't talk about that. It may be a false equivalency, but when you talk about what's going on in Qatar and you talk about what's going on in the United States with immigrants trying to come across the Mexican border and the the abuse of farm workers here just in California, right outside our doors here. Is it different from Qatar? Yes. But is the concept the same? Yes, it is. So if we're going to criticize the Qataris, I think we have to be aware of what's going on in our country too.
Great. I wanted to see if there's any questions here in the audience. Yes, I see one, Dr. Osaki.
Thank you very much. Kevin, really excited to hear your comments and your insights, and I certainly look forward to following your coverage from the World Cup in the LA Times. Matthew, great to see your presentation. Thank you for sharing a lot of those personal photos that you had taken at the World Expo. My question is about World Expos, these types of global mega events and their value in the domestic markets, because I think it's different in the US from what I've experienced. While I was working overseas from 2005 to 2019, I think we had 6 World Cups during that period, and the one in Dubai was the first since I've been back to the US. But in each of those years, I noticed that different countries that I was working with, there was still a lot of energy and some excitement about World Cups, and even outside of China, Japan, and Korea, which hosted expos, which hosted World Expos during that time. But to see that the U.S. spends a lot of money, the infrastructure that's built in, you mentioned about acts like Christina Aguilera and Alicia Keys being presenting there. But I think you said there were only a half a dozen states, U.S. states, that sent delegations to Dubai. I'm wondering if you believe there is a role for these global mega events in the U.S., because I do see it in the other countries that I'm familiar with, but I don't even recall seeing many stories in American media during the World Expo, which, over that 6-month period. But I'd love to know your thoughts about whether it is just for global branding overseas, or if something can be done to, because I think the American population would benefit greatly by learning about what's happening in these countries. Because, I mean, as Kevin said, the World Cup is a situation where Qatar has said, we're going to kind of open up our closet and we want people to come and see, and Dubai the same way. And yet I don't know that very many Americans have or will see.
So that's a great question, Glenn. Thanks for coming out here. And again, for all of USC's support here for the Center on Public Diplomacy and the research that's being done. The truth is that the United States hasn't hosted a World's Fair since 1984. And so the majority of although we've hosted more than 24, since the first one in Philadelphia in 1876. So there's a lack of awareness really within the country about what these events are. We had, as I said, half a dozen states, half a dozen cities participate with trade delegations. The Department of Commerce brought the largest overseas trade delegation, what's called Trade Winds, to Dubai. And they spread out throughout the entire Middle East and went to South Asia. But one of the interesting things and exciting things that I did right before I went out to Dubai was support the U.S.'s bid to host the 2023 World's Fair in Minnesota. And unfortunately, we didn't prevail in that vote. It's an international organization. The United States needs to win the trust and confidence of all of our partners around the world, but we're back at it. And so the United States is bidding to host the 2027 World's Fair. It's a specialized exposition. It's a shorter and smaller one in Minnesota. Healthy living, healthy planet. And so it's quite exciting because, the last time the U.S. hosted a World's Fair was 1984. The last time we hosted, the Summer Olympics was 1996. And the last time that we hosted the World Cup was in 1994, the Men's World Cup. And so now, though, we have coming up, and I think maybe this is a good place to end on, we have in 2026, the Tri-National Men's World Cup that's coming here to LA and other cities. We have potentially the 2027 World's Fair in Minnesota if we're successful at the vote next summer, and then the 2028 Summer Olympics.
That may have the 2027 Women's World Cup.
So again, you talk about the global mega events, not having done it for 2 decades, 3 decades, almost 4 decades in some case, and now all of a sudden we're going to have 1, 2, maybe even 3. That's quite exciting. And I think that's an opportunity for our country, for the United States, to shine, to present itself, and to get ready. And you're seeing this already here in Los Angeles and some of the other host cities. But maybe just on that note, since Kevin, you've been here in Los Angeles for a bit of time and you've covered these events. What should LA and the other American cities be thinking about as they watch what's happening in Doha in FIFA 2022?
Well, if they're, especially Los Angeles with the Olympics, I think you want to think about housing outside the city. One of the things with these mega international events that you see is the tourists love coming in. The locals who have to try to get to work into the supermarket, they're not so excited about it. But it is a real chance to, as we will find out, this fall in Qatar, it is a real chance to show off your stuff for countries to put their best foot forward. The world will be watching. That's part of the price. The world will be watching. That means they'll see the good, but they'll also see the bad. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind. I mean, it is a chance to showcase your city, but make sure that you're showcasing the things that you want people to see.
So again, I want to thank everyone that joined us online here for this event, everyone that came out to Annenberg the day after Halloween. And I want to wish Kevin a safe journeys to Doha. And thank you for joining us today and for all the reporting that you've done on this. And again, if you are planning to visit Doha or travel to the region or travel anywhere, please do check out travel.state.gov. Thank you very much and have a great day.